So a hunter takes over. And as opposed to being these hunters that enrich themselves, where the leader in that hunter effectively takes advantage and is a dictator over top of the population, this is more like Napoleon trying to right the ship of French Revolution, where France goes haywire. And he, in this case, seems to be doing what is in the best interest of Burkina Faso at the expense of Western nations like France, who they kicked out, or for that matter, like the US, who wants to get rid of him. So, is there any wonder? Is there any wonder that this happens immediately after he gets back from Moscow? Now, keep in mind, there have been multiple assassinations attempts trying to murder him, to get rid of him again, to make a lesson of him. And what do you know? Al Qaeda just so happens to attack Burkina Faso. And let's be very clear, Al Qaeda has been a US proxy for years, whether it was going after Libya, whether it was going after Syria. They have been a proxy of Western interests. I would point out to you, this is not random. What you're watching is an ambush where Al-Qaeda fighters effectively attacked military installations in Burkina Faso. Now, they caught them off guard. Apparently, they killed several. And again, not random in the least. It is as predictable as the sun is coming out the very next day. This is obviously sponsored by the West. Apparently, and I'll just read it. At dawn, hundreds of militants attacked from the West, targeting the 26th Rapid Response Unit, while many soldiers were still sleeping, killing some as they tried to flee. The assault lasted nearly half a day, left up to 100 civilians and soldiers dead. That's not random. That's not random. There's a reason the Russian commandos and North Korean commandos ended up in Burkina Faso. Yes, part of it was protect Ibrahim Traore. The other part of it, however, was also to ensure the integrity of the state, because they understood that that state was going to be under stress and pressure with Western forces now trying to find a way to get at them. They may not want their fingerprints on it, and so instead they use their proxies, in this case, terrorists, as we call them. It's super ironic that Donald Trump was talking about Iran using terrorists when the United States has used them over and over and over again. Taliban would be one really good example. The Mujahideen at one point, when they were used in regards to going after the Soviet Union, that dragged them into their own Vietnam. If you remember, the Pakistani guy who was talking about terrorists in Pakistan pointed out, well, we had them on behalf of the West also. Just so you know, British broadcaster who wants to bring this up. So yeah, Burkina Faso is under threat. And if you remember, the guy from AFRICOM pointed out this is a problem. You get reports saying, oh my God, he's trying to steal the gold for his own self-enrichment. No, it's for the aggrandizement, and it's for the enrichment of Burkina Faso itself, meaning this notion of making banks, and for the enrichment of Africa. And it makes a symbol. The resources of Africa, which is a rich continent, should be used for the people of Africa. And this notion of exploitation at some point needs to stop. I want to bring in my guests. I am joined with the man himself, Caleb Maupin. I always say everything Caleb says is fantastic. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author. He has a book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris, puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and geopolitical stage. That is an old book. He has a new book out, and I'm going to ask you the name of that book right now, Caleb.
Oh, well, I don't know. I have quite a few books that I've published over the years and such. I've been publishing a lot of different compilations of articles and such. In terms of new material, my latest is called Khrushchevism: A Study in Psychological Warfare. You can get a copy of that wherever books are sold. It's pretty widely distributed. But yeah, I'm putting out stuff all the time. This anti-imperialist, anti-globalist message about
Wait,
having
what's the name of that new book? I'm sorry, give me that name one more time.
Sure, it's called Khrushchevism: A Study in Psychological Warfare.
And you talk about Khrushchev in regards to the Soviet leader.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what it's about. Yeah, it's about Khrushchev and the secret speech of 1956 and efforts to dismantle the global communist movement and weaken the Soviet Union, isolate it from its allies, and how Khrushchev's denunciation of his predecessor Stalin was used in a very manipulative way. And so, yeah, I go into a lot of research in the book, and it actually relates a lot to what you were talking about. When you talk about the use of these terrorist forces as proxies, etc. There's a book that I often will reference called Gangs and Counter Gangs, and it was written by Frank Kitson, who was a British intelligence officer in Kenya during the Land and Freedom Uprising, the Mau Mau Uprising in Kenya in the 1950s, where the people of Kenya fought against British colonialism. In order to defeat the uprising, the British started hiring Africans who were former Mau Mau fighters and others, and sending them out as what they called counter gangs to gather information, to pose as Mau Mau and commit atrocities that would be blamed on the Mau Mau. That would, in addition to that, they would confuse the population. People didn't know who the real Mau Mau fighters were and who were the ones paid by the British, who were the so-called counter gangs. And they created so much confusion, they were able to ultimately defeat the uprising. Now, there's a really good book called Imperial Reckoning that talks about how a lot of what the British did was they just rounded up all the men and held them in these kind of mini concentration camps. That was a big part of the victory as well. But the use of counter gangs, were like insurgent fighters of their own to defeat an insurgency and to confuse the populations. The population couldn't tell who the real insurgents were. That became like a staple of counterinsurgency operations. Frank Kitson was heavily involved in the British fight in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s, the Troubles. And that, if you read what's been written about insurgencies, counterinsurgency warfare, etc., that tactic of cultivating extremists or fighters of your own as a way of muddying the water and confusing things, that's been kind of a key way the United States has waged counterinsurgencies around the world, and cultivating these kind of proxy forces like Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan, like the various terrorist groups in Syria that have successfully overthrown the Syrian government. That's an effective way of kind of confusing people, right? The USA was defeated in Vietnam because it was pretty clear it was the Vietnamese people versus the foreign occupier, and that's how the United States was able to lose. But in the aftermath of the U.S. losing the Vietnam War, U.S. foreign policy was kind of restructured, and with the rise of Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, with the Trilateral Commission, the focus kind of became more on how do we muddy the waters of these national liberation movements? How do we muddy the waters of these situations so it's not so clear who's on what side? So there are different forces contending for power. We back some sometimes, we back some the other times. Zbigniew Brzezinski, he wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard, he said the strategy is to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. And if you look at what the USA did after the Vietnam War, like, for example, there was a war in the 1980s, the Iraq-Iran War, and the USA was on both sides of it at various times. At the beginning, they were supporting Iraq against Iran. Later, towards the end of the war, they were supporting Iran against Iraq. But they really saw both countries, both Ba'athist Arab socialism in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and the Islamic Revolution of Iran, they saw them both as a threat. And they were both anti-colonial, anti-imperialist forces. But it was, how do we manipulate them against each other? How do we draw a river of blood between Arab nationalists and Islamic Shia revolutionary forces, make sure they would never work with each other? How do we manipulate those forces? This is ultimately how the USA has been successful in defeating anti-colonial uprisings, how the USA kind of won the Cold War. So what you were describing there with the fact that they're now using, these extremist forces in Burkina Faso to target, the revolutionary government of Ibrahim Traore, that's not at all new or surprising. You look to Nigeria, where you have Boko Haram, which now calls itself ISIS in Africa, which is basically sponsored by the local level of the Nigerian government in Muslim regions. But yet the USA has used Boko Haram as an excuse to increase its military presence in Africa. There's that whole "bring back our girls" thing that was, Michelle Obama and others were pushing. But basically the Nigerian government and Saudi Arabia have ties to this, terrorist group in Nigeria that then the USA is able to use to send its military, into Africa and expand its military presence. That went on. And then there is a group in Nigeria called the Islamic Movement in Nigeria that are Shia Muslims that have been trying to bring Christians and Muslims in Nigeria together. And you'll notice the USA backed the Nigerian government in brutally repressing them. And Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki was detained and held by the Nigerian military for years without charges. Their compounds were forcibly broken up. So Boko Haram, expands in the Islamic regions. There's tension between Christians and Muslims, but then you have an actual anti-imperialist force in the country that gets very heavily suppressed. And that, there are people that were in Guantanamo Bay for years that are now in the Taliban government in Afghanistan. And you have to ask what went on all those years they were sitting in Guantanamo Bay. The USA was, at least U.S. officials, intelligence was learning to push their buttons, learning to manipulate them. The Taliban, the Al Qaeda, those kind of forces in Afghanistan were already kind of used by the USA as proxies to fight against the Soviet Union. And so then you have their leaders sitting in a prison, for years, an isolated prison, a prison where there's no record, right? They're not as official prisoners, but they're subject to whatever was going on in Guantanamo Bay. And then they're released, and then they're in the government of Afghanistan. Well, that's years the USA has had to study them and learn how they operate, and who knows what kind of weird psychological experiments and mind control was done to them. And now they're the government of Afghanistan. So you have to look at all of this, and the cultivation of extremist forces to confuse things, to make it so anti-colonial fights are not clear. That's generally how the imperialists have been operating.
God, that's such a good point. If you think of like these right-wing lunatics that you can effectively either bribe or who's willing to commit violence in order to take power, whether it's in South America, when you get these kind of death squads that the U.S. was backing, hell, Ukraine, where you get the neo-Nazis, the banderites that are willing to, again, function as a proxy, or in Africa. There was a widespread belief in Africa that, as you point out, that the reason that the French would argue, well, we're here because we're fighting terrorism, or the U.S. is like, well, we're building this massive military basis in order to fight terrorism, that they were using the terrorists in order to create the justification for them being there with a military presence, not that they were trying to get rid of the terrorists, quote unquote, as they call them. And so, when Russia's sending commandos, or when North Korea is sending commandos, it's to protect the integrity of the state. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that Ibrahim Traore is in Moscow getting these accolades for like 3 days. And then Burkina Faso gets hit almost immediately when he gets back. And you already have AFRICOM chief saying, hey, that guy's a problem, and is giving statements talking about, we need to get rid of this guy. I don't think it's coincidence at all.
In some cases, they make it blatantly obvious. You remember the Crocus city concert, the music concert in Russia that was attacked by Islamic extremists, and the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government basically announced a couple of weeks beforehand that there was going to be some kind of attack at a public gathering at a concert. That was, they apparently had the information this attack was going to happen, and they issued the threat beforehand, just so Russia would get the message that, this came from us. That was a U.S. military attack on Russia. That was a U.S. sponsored terrorist attack, in my view. If the U.S. government basically announced it's going to happen beforehand, and then it happens, these extremist forces, there was a huge explosion of the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam in the 1970s and 80s, because
Right.
Saudi Arabia, which is a U.S.-aligned government, they have the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, which is a very strict fundamentalist interpretation. That they want to restore the caliphate. They want to live as exactly as the Prophet Muhammad lived, right? As a Sunni Wahhabi, and some people talk about Takfiri or Salafi. There's different words people use, but it's the Saudi interpretation of Islam. Is largely what is used by ISIS, largely what is used by the forces that previously were called Al Qaeda and such, and that exploded in popularity because Saudi Arabia, a U.S.-aligned government, started spreading it all across the world, and that ideology was the basis on which fighters were recruited to go to Afghanistan. It was also the basis on which Chechen separatists were cultivated to fight against the Soviet Union, and that all across the Muslim world, you had the rise of these Wahhabi extremist groups that were a response to the fact that many in the Middle East were attracted to communism or Ba'athist Arab socialism or the Shia Islamic revolutionary ideology or whatever. They were attracted to that. So the USA had its ally, Saudi Arabia, develop its own following with its own interpretation that was critical of the West, was certainly critical of Western capitalism and the Western system, but was very, very much focused on defeating anti-imperialist forces and very much violent, and very much kind of glorified the political model they have in Saudi Arabia, which is reminiscent of feudalism. I mean, Saudi Arabia is basically a country with oil and sand in it, where most of the population are guest worker slaves that have no rights whatsoever, and the king has absolute power. Everyone in the country is his property, is his subject. According to the Constitution. I mean, what they call their Constitution basically says you have no rights. The king has all the power. And that's the government the USA has propped up in the Middle East, and they have this kind of primitive system. What I find to be infuriating is, that the West blames the people in the Middle East for things like Saudi Arabia, right? It's like, oh, well, this is how the people in the Middle East just are. Well, no, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is what's backed and armed by the United States. That's the government we propped up. The governments we target are the ones that are the ones that are educating people. I mean, Gaddafi's Libya, women's rights was far higher. Saddam Hussein, there were Christians in the government. There was all kinds of, and in Iran, I've been to Iran. They have women in the parliament. They have women who are generals in the military in Iran. They have elections in Iran. It's it was the Republic of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? It was the Syrian Arab Republic under Bashar Assad, and the allies of the United States tend to be, it's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's the Sultanates, all the things that we then blame. We say, oh, the people over there are just primitive, or all the things that the West props up, and it's the progressive independent governments that are the ones that are targeted.
Afghanistan, before they overthrew, what was the guy named? What is it? Mogadef. Is that right? Mogadef. I may be getting the name wrong, but they used to have miniskirts in Afghanistan, for God's sake, before the U.S. got involved in that country and they got rid of them. I mean, I remember when I was in Kenya, one of the guys told me at one point, he says, there's a U.S. military base here. And he said the U.S. recruits Kenyans in order to go fight wars abroad on behalf of the United States. And I was like, no way. He says, I can show you the base. I can show you my friend in a U.S. military outfit. And he says the things that they do in some of these other countries, he says, but they do it because it's an impoverished country. They need the money. And so if the U.S. is willing to pay them, they're willing to effectively do that stuff in order to feed their families. And I would imagine that's playbook, right? I mean, that's just kind of the way it works. And this leads into the other conversation that I brought you on for. The National Endowment for Democracy. Now, a lot was being made that Donald Trump got rid of NED and US Aid. And they were like, oh my God, Donald Trump is a new lease on life. He's changing things around for the better, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it was just moved to the State Department. There's that. Two, some people would argue, well, there was lawsuits that forced Trump to bring it back. Yeah, but he brought it back under the State Department. It seemed like the issue more so had to do with we don't want it to be a rogue actor doing what it wants on its own, going after governments where we may not necessarily want. For example, going after Hungary. For example, Hungary is a close friend of Donald Trump. So if USAID is trying to do something to get rid of Orban, well, that is against Donald Trump's interests. He doesn't really want that. He doesn't want it to be a rogue actor. He doesn't want to be like a Jeremy Corbyn thing, right? Where Jeremy Corbyn is running and you have, what is that? It was a organization that was in Britain that was even paid by the British government to go after Russian propaganda, quote unquote, and was defining Jeremy Corbyn as being part of Russian propaganda. And so it was undercutting Jeremy Corbyn. Okay, well, Trump doesn't want that. He's learned his lesson on some level from the first time around. USAID is an issue, especially with the Ukraine thing. That's another issue, right? And so they want it under the auspices of the State Department being controlled by the government as opposed to being doing its own thing. And so it is now under Rubio's control, and they have defined various states that they want to get rid of to give some quote unquote freedom, which is apparently these color revolutions. One, and I'll show this too, Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela, and of course, other locations, I would imagine. Right here, we commend the State Department for this move under Secretary Rubio's leadership, said Representative Peter Roskam, NED board chairman. These are important steps towards fully restoring our ability to support frontline defenders of democracy and repressive regimes, including Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, China, Russia, and elsewhere. Ain't that special? So in one sense, Trump is supposedly having negotiations to end wars in Iran, or I should say in Ukraine and Russia, but also Iran, making a negotiation with Iran, while simultaneously putting out press releases that they are also trying to, I would imagine, create color revolutions in those same countries. That's astonishing.
Yeah, well, I think the big purge and the shutting down of USAID, et cetera, that was revenge because those institutions clearly worked against Trump. That's what was happening. It was the fact that these institutions were utilized by people aligned with Biden and the U.S. foreign policy apparatus to put out the message that Donald Trump was an agent of Russia, that Donald Trump was untrustworthy, that Donald Trump was not good for American imperialist interests, and they were used, in a partisan way in the political process. And so it was necessary to really punish those forces, to lay off a lot of people, to make a big show of just kind of triumphantly tearing them down. And now they're being brought back in a way that, Marco Rubio is a foreign policy hawk like you wouldn't believe. I mean, this guy's he's a Miami Cuban. He's tied in with the Israel lobby. He's tied in with every anti-communist, that's anti-communism is his whole identity, right? As a Miami Cuban. I mean, he's part of the neocon apparatus. So now the NED is back under Marco Rubio's direction, and it appears that they will apparently be more focused on carrying out U.S. foreign policy goals, not as tied in with kind of liberal activism as they may have been previously. That's really what the Trump folks don't like, is they don't like that that essentially the CIA. The CIA have always been liberals. You go back to the McCarthy era. Joe McCarthy was accusing the CIA of being communist infiltrated, and the FBI was agreeing with him. And in the 50s, even at the height of McCarthyism, you had the CIA that was hiring Trotskyite communists and hiring liberal artists and others to make things that were very critical of U.S. society, but also anti-Soviet. And trying to kind of steal the thunder of the so-called left to isolate the Soviet-aligned communist forces, which were quite powerful in Western Europe and other places, and create like a space where you could be left and you could be critical of U.S. society, but you would not be aligned with the anti-imperialist, Soviet Union, with the anti-imperialist forces in China and the developing world, Africa, et cetera. And that's long been a CIA strategy. Is kind of isolating the left by creating a mechanism, creating your own dissidents, so to speak. that has long been their strategy. And those dissidents tend to be quite critical of people like Donald Trump. And in particular, I mean, there were more recent examples. I mean, you remember during the Bush years, Dick Cheney outed Valerie Plame. All right. And remember, that was a big case where a CIA agent who was critical and was quite critical of the Bush administration. You saw, the vice president, I believe, come out and just, violate and reveal classified information and reveal her reputation in order, as revenge, and then get, there was no response to it. And that a lot of these leaks, I mean, Tulsi Gabbard is continuously talking about how there's all these leaks of classified activities, all kinds of stuff the Trump administration does behind closed doors ends up in the New York Times, ends up in the press. And that's the intelligence community. I mean, there was that whole phone call between Zelensky and Trump, which the actual phone call itself, the text of it, was Trump called it a perfect phone call, but somehow the intelligence agencies detected that there was some kind of, offer or something, and that was the basis of Trump's impeachment. You'll recall, and that the intelligence agencies are monitoring the Trump administration, leaking its information to the press. And it's really, there's a lot of talk. I think Bill Moyers of PBS at one point did a piece called The Shadow Government or the Secret Government. I mean, the intelligence agencies very much view themselves as above the elected government. And, with their links to media, with their links to various armed groups and various factions, and their networking with other Western governments, right? I mean, the British intelligence, the French intelligence, and all of that. With those links, they're able to do things that the elected government that's supposed to be in charge of them, that pays their bills, that pays their paychecks, doesn't want them to do, and that the intelligence apparatus is kind of above the elected government. It's kind of a shadowy section of the American apparatus that is embedded in very powerful places, and the elected government doesn't really have the ability to control it.
I mean, they just don't try to. It doesn't seem like they try to. I mean, if you think of when Brennan, for example, was spying on Congress, and they caught him spying on Congress. They were looking into the torture report, and Brennan, who was head of the CIA at the time, was concerned about, okay, well, what is Congress actually looking into? They caught him doing it. There was no consequences for it, even when he came to Congress and lied about it. Clapper came to Congress, lied to Congress, FBI director at the time, no consequences. So it's not like they put the screws to him. It's not like Kennedy, where he's like, I'm going to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces. That is not what they do. They could, they just don't. Or correct me if I'm wrong. Do you agree with that?
Well, no, I think that when Trump first came in with the Doge, with Elon Musk, they made a big show of kind of punishing these forces, and then but they ultimately have to bring them back. But they just want to bring them back in a way that is less partisan, right? They didn't appreciate the blatantly partisan nature of these forces, the way they were anti-Trump, and so they're back and they're continuing to do what they do. But they had to make a big show of at least inflicting some damage on them and trying to show them, we're not going to let you work to undermine our administration as we previously have. Also, I think compromises were made. I mean, I think Marco Rubio is the new John Bolton. I mean, John Bolton was working against Trump's foreign policy goals on the Korean Peninsula and elsewhere. And it looks to me, I mean, I listened to what various other forces are saying. And I mean, it seems to me that Marco Rubio, while he says publicly the Trump administration line, I think he does not want a better relationship with Russia. I think he does not want a better relationship with North Korea. And I think that behind the scenes, he's certainly maneuvering. Why do we not have peace in Ukraine? Trump said he could do it in 24 hours. I think Trump probably believed he could do it in 24 hours. But there are people on his team who don't want that pretty clearly.
You honestly believe that Donald Trump thought he could do that in 24 hours?
Yeah, I think Trump probably looked at what Russia was offering and said, I'll just give that. Fine, it's over. And then, his team said, well, no, we can't give Russia that, and that he was surrounded by people that weren't willing to actually move forward. I mean, you and I both know that this war would end if Russia had an understanding that there wasn't going to be a NATO country on their border, if the new republics were recognized, and that the war would end immediately. I mean, Russia's wanted to negotiate this. Russia held off their special military operation as long as they possibly could. They don't want to be involved in this conflict. And yeah, I think there's a couple of key buttons that could be pushed and this conflict would end. But it's not simply a matter of President Donald Trump doing it himself. It's a matter of he has a whole team of people, and he has European allies, and he has people like Marco Rubio and others who would never give that to Russia and are going to resist giving that to Russia and are going to try to make deals that don't result in Russia getting the security it needs, and that they really don't ultimately want to see peace in the country. They'll do it if they have to, maybe, but they'll try their hardest to maneuver and prevent that from happening. And it's unfortunate, but this applies even on a smaller scale, right? That any leader is as strong as his team, and Trump's team sucks. I mean, it sucks. There's a lot of people on it who are no good. Tulsi Gabbard is a little bit better in some ways. I mean, I certainly don't like what she said about Israel and some other things, but she's a little bit better. But there's a lot of people on Trump's team that are just the same old neocon crowd. And I think at the end of the day, Trump doesn't really know that much. I mean, he's not a foreign policy guy in his background, right? He's a Wall Street real estate guy, who very much wants to be popular, very much wants to be reelected, and that he's got various different people telling him different things.
I know, but Trump is the president. Trump could have walked. Trump could have said, "This is Joe Biden's war. I'm done. I'm walking." Trump could have said, "I'm stopping the weapons. I'm stopping all of this stuff. I want to make an agreement." What Russia is asking for is not insane.
No, it's not.
Basically, what they asked for was, look, we'll give you the ceasefire, but we don't want additional weapons coming into Ukraine. We don't want you building up a military. We don't want you continuing to give them intelligence. We don't want you doing those things, and we will do a ceasefire. Trump didn't want to do it because, according to the reporting, he didn't want to look as if it was his fault that the war was lost. That is, as you pointed out, that's his psychology. That's him. That's not, meaning he chose Rubio. He didn't have to. He chose Kellogg. He didn't have to. He made choices for this stuff. I understand that people want to give Trump, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but I often hear this argument that people give Trump a pass on. I heard Ritter recently giving Trump a pass on it, saying Rubio is the one who's crashing the deal. Trump is the president of the United States. If Trump wanted to walk, Trump could have walked. If Trump wanted to stop the weapons, Trump could have stopped the weapons. He did it once before. He could do it anytime he wanted to. Zelensky is the U.S. proxy. If Trump tells Zelensky, and by the way, Europe can't do it on their own. So if Trump says, "I am done. This is Joe Biden's war. I'm pivoting to China and starting a mess with China," he could have did that on day one. He chose not to.
Look at Yemen, for example. Trump withdrew the U.S. battleship, the U.S. aircraft carrier from the Red Sea, and he framed it as a victory. He said, "Oh, look, we made the Houthis back down and all of that." If you actually look at what happened, that's not what happened. Right. The USA almost lost their aircraft carrier, and it was going to be a question of, is the USA going to keep a military presence in the Red Sea and have sailors and soldiers start coming home in body bags? Or is the USA just going to say, you know what, Houthis don't attack any U.S. ships. Okay, fine. And Israel, you're on your own. And, really, that was a huge win for the Houthis. That was a huge win for Yemen, that they forced the United States out of the Red Sea. And they basically had the United States say, if you keep attacking Israeli ships, that's on you. Just don't touch American ships. But Trump framed it as this great dramatic win. He could do the same thing with Ukraine. He could say, well, I told them, because that's the whole thing. They claim, right, that somehow Russia wants to take Kiev, that Russia wants to take all of Ukraine, which they do not. Right. So Trump can say, well, I told him that you can't go 1 inch further, and he could make a big show. And, I drew this line and I told him if you cross that, he could frame it as a win. He doesn't have to look like a defeat. Right. Donald Trump could easily do that. And in the age of media, and that's how Donald Trump does things. Right. He always makes it look like he won. So he could do that with Russia if he wanted to. He could very easily. The idea that he can't look like he lost the war. Well, he could frame it like he did with Yemen. He could make it sound like he won somehow and sign an agreement. He could very easily do that. So,
I guess I'm saying he could have done that on day one.
Yes, he could have. Yeah. But it seems like he's got a team of people around him who don't want that to happen. And it seems that also his coalition has got people in it who wouldn't give him a pass on it. I mean, it looks like he got a pass on Yemen. Israel was certainly angry. Israel knew that Trump had kind of not given them what they wanted. But there were a lot of people around Trump who echoed his saying, "Oh yeah, he got him, he won." But it looks like those people may not have done that for Trump when it came to Russia. I think that's what we're getting, is that the response of the media would have been, "You lost," and that there would have been a lot of voices that wouldn't have had his back, and he would have been weakened, right? That his coalition wasn't all there with him to do it. And that's why these people like Marco Rubio are so dangerous, right? Is that it's that they mouth the Trump line, while what they want is clearly very opposite of what Trump has stated he wants. And I don't think Trump necessarily even wants what he says he wants. I think Trump wants to be popular. I think Trump wants to be, a successful, president who's remembered really well. And that's what's important to Trump more than anything. And that's why they don't like him, right? And that's what I've said. There's all this stuff about Trump is so selfish. Trump is so selfish. I wish Trump was more selfish. If Trump was more selfish, he would have ended the war, because he just wanted to be remembered that way. But, he's not a team player for empire. He just wants to be remembered as a great leader. And I think that's a good thing about Trump. And he's more independent in that way. He's not independent enough. I would like Trump to be so selfish that he says, you know what, I'm going to bring the troops home from around the world. And I'm going to, put them to work rebuilding America's crumbling roads and infrastructure. I'm going to hire all the unemployed people. That would be great. If Trump was so selfish that he did things that were good for the American people and good for the world, and not what our, foreign policy establishment and, deep state wants, that would be awesome. And I think that's why they're afraid of him, is that he has some capacity to do that, some ability to be pushed to do that despite everything. I just wish he would be more selfish. I wish that he would do these things in more of a way. And, his presidency so far has been a wild disappointment. I think there are a couple areas where you could say, that we're better off, but, it's small, and, ultimately it's about the balance of forces at the end of the day. Everything is about the balance of forces, and the balance of forces are still on the side of imperialism, no doubt about it.
Caleb, I'm going to end it on that. I so disagree with that. Kind of. I agree with what you want. I agree with that part. Okay. It's just, if Trump wanted to be popular, he would do exactly what you just said. I don't know if he cares about the popularity and to that degree, but I could be wrong. Caleb, man, I always appreciate you joining. Sure. Like I said, I always appreciate everything that comes out of your mouth. It's always fantastic. Caleb Maupin, he is speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author, several books, including the last one on Khrushchev, which I have to check out. I didn't know that was the last one that you had written. The one I remember is the one on the one who killed who murdered the CEO, the healthcare CEO.
Yeah. The killing of Brian Thompson and the danger of the American years of lead. Yeah.
That was the one I remember. I didn't know anything about the Khrushchev one. I'm going to have to get a list of those books so I can put into the bio. Please send me a few.
Will do.
Just so I would have it.
Will do.
But Caleb Maupin, you can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin, read his articles at calebmaupin.com. And you're also a part of a political organization. Please
That's right. Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. So
cpiusa.org. Caleb, thank you for this, man. I really appreciate it. You be safe, okay?
You too. Thanks.
All